Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Smart Living. In my last video, I walked through the full installation of my home battery backup system, the Sol-Ark 18K hybrid inverter paired with Pytes V5 batteries. But after posting that video, I realized something important. A lot of people want to know more than just how it was installed. They want to know exactly what parts were used. Not just the big expensive components, but all the smaller pieces too. The exact disconnects, breakers, bypass switch, wireway, cables, connectors, everything that actually makes the system work. While I showed that briefly along with the total price, I didn't elaborate on anything. So in this video, I'm going to walk through every major component I purchased, including the specific model numbers, why I chose them, and how they fit into the overall system. Now, don't forget, if you like this kind of content, hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help the channel grow. It'll also let you know when I post future content. Now, before we go any further into the video, everything that I'm going to talk about, for the most part, you can find in the description of my video. So all the links are right there, and they are affiliate links, so I do get a little bit of a commission if you buy from them, which helps me provide this content to you. Now, if I take a look at my description of the videos, I've got a link here for Signature Solar. I've got an Amazon storefront. I've got Battery Cables USA, and I did use Battery Cables USA for all my cable requirements instead of here for the battery portion of it. And then I've got a Lowe's storefront here. And then the diagrams for the battery installation process on my channel is going to be at this Dropbox location there. So if you want the diagram and the cost breakdown for what I did for my install, that'll be here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Signature Solar and some of these other options here so you can kind of get a sense for what options you have if you click on these links. So for Signature Solar, I primarily got the Pytes V5. So if you type in Pytes V5, you'll find the battery options as well as this Wi-Fi stick here. And then if you wanted these other things, I considered getting these also, but again, I wanted to have more batteries in my stack than this would allow for. And then you've got your actual Pytes V5 battery right here. This is where I would go to get the Pytes V5 batteries, as well as that Wi-Fi dongle, should you want that. 99% of the time, if I need something for my house that's going to be related to solar or battery, I'm going to go to Signature Solar to look for that product there first. Again, the customer service you get from Signature Solar is hands down the best that you can find anywhere. Now, here's my Amazon storefront. So if you click on the link, you're going to get access to all this information here as well. And I've got my solar battery tools. So this would be all the tools that I used as part of this installation. And in some regards, my installers actually use a lot of my tools too, because they actually work better for what they're trying to do. Or they were just curious and wanted to test things out. Like in the case of this client, this doesn't work for battery cables, by the way, but this right here does work great for the service entrance cables. And they tried that out and wanted to see how it worked. And they seem to like that as well. But then if we come over here, we can see that this list here will have most of the equipment that I bought, whether it's the disconnect or the battery disconnects or some of the rack type stuff. And then here is just about everything else. So if I click on this one here, for example, I did get these for the actual stickers that go on some of the equipment. I got all the heat shrink here, and I got most everything else from here. To include these, so if you like that gold color, this is also where I got those for my installation, was from Amazon. Now there are different sizes for the disconnect and for the bypass. It goes all the way up to 3-inch rain tights or conduit. I didn't feel like 3 inches was necessary, but I did go with the 2.5-inch for that. And then I went with mostly 2-inch on the Sol-Ark. So you'll see that most of those are what I've got here. But again, a lot of stuff on this Amazon storefront. And yes, I do earn commission, so it does tell you that right here. But if we go over here, I've got some other things that I've done for my house, whether it's some plumbing stuff, some of my lawn and garden type stuff. And I also put in radiant barrier. I might do a video on what that was like as well. I did that towards the end of last year also. But most everything that I do for my house or as part of this channel, you're going to find on the Amazon storefront. It's kind of hard to beat the shipping rates at free. I've got an Amazon Prime account, so all the shippings for the most part is free. And the prices are pretty comparable to what you get in other places. Next is Battery Cable USA. It is a US company, so you're supporting a US company if you use them. Phenomenal battery cables. And again, I did do an inspection as part of my process, so it passed the inspection. These are UL listed cables. And if we want, we can just go click Start here. And then we're going to find our 4-aught. All the cables I used as part of this install are 4-aught. And you've got multiple options. Now I went with this ultimate option right here. And I'm going to cover this in the video, but a very robust option. You could just get the cable itself and it'll tell you all about the number of strands, This stuff is phenomenal. It is very well designed cable, works great. Can't say enough good things about Battery Cable USA. Plus, the shipping times were phenomenal. I think 3 days on average is how long it took for 50-foot cables to be shipped to me. So really great company. Plus, I actually ordered too much and returned some of the battery cable, and they had no problems doing that process. Next, we've got my Lowe's storefront here. And again, this is where I got the double throw. So if you're interested in the double throw, you're gonna wanna check out that Lowe's link. But I also have a lot of other things on here to include the lawnmower that I use, and I like the Ego products, so I buy a lot of Ego products. And I bought some of this stuff on Amazon, so you'll see some things are there. Sometimes it's a little cheaper for Lowe's versus Amazon if you have a military discount, because you get that 10% additional discount. And then I recently updated the washer and dryer, so you're going to see a lot of stuff on my Lowe's, and I'll keep adding things to this. I haven't fully built out any of these portables at this point. But again, everything that I'm going to talk about in this video here, whether it's the double throw or the disconnect, all of it's going to be in the links in the description of the video. Quick overview so everything makes sense. This system ties together 3 main pieces: my existing Enphase solar system, the utility grid, a new battery backup system. At the center of all of it is the Sol-Ark 18K hybrid inverter. Solar and grid power feed into the Sol-Ark, the batteries connect to it, and the output from the Sol-Ark powers the house. Every component I'm going to show you supports that basic flow of energy. The brain of the whole system is the Sol-Ark 18K. I chose this because it supports whole home backup, works with third-party batteries, has 200 amp pass-through, can charge from solar grid or generator, and gives me tons of room to expand later. Plus, it's the most powerful inverter available right now, capable of providing 75 amps to the home consistently. So it doesn't rely on solar being present, it just runs it off the battery. As long as I've got enough batteries and my batteries are capable of providing enough power, the Sol-Ark 18K can provide 75 amps to my house consistent. Since I already had Enphase microinverters on the roof, the Sol-Ark let me add batteries without replacing my existing solar system. I did put a lot of thought into whether I should get DC optimizers instead of the microinverters. But in the end, the Enphase microinverters tend to provide more power in my specific circumstances where I've got a lot of shade issues. For energy storage, I went with the Pytes V5 lithium iron phosphate batteries. The reason I chose them is because they're UL listed. There's a ton of batteries on the market, way more batteries than probably I'm even aware of. There's just a ton of batteries, but not all of them are UL listed. And being UL listed was important to me. I wanted to make sure that I could actually do a permit, get inspected, and pass an inspection along with doing the net metering program through Dominion. So I wanted to make sure I picked UL listed items as part of my installation. Pytes V5 batteries have excellent price per kilowatt hour, proven reliability, clean rack mount design, easy integration with the Sol-Ark, and are fully expandable. Plus, they have the best charge discharge rate I found in any rack mounted battery. Now again, I didn't look at every single option out there, and right now Pytes has the best recommended charge and discharge of 75 amps. With full 1C possible, and they have a surge capacity for everything from 101 amps to 120 amps for 3 minutes, or 121 amps to 180 amps for 15 seconds. So a very robust and capable battery system. They form the backbone of the backup system when the grid goes down. Now, for the battery rack, this is an interesting topic, and I'm going to cover this a little bit more in depth when I talk about batteries in general. But for the rack, Pytes offers essentially a 3 battery rack, which is stackable, so you can stack it up to 6. And I actually talked to Pytes and they said you could rack it up to 9 batteries, so 3 racks of 3. But the problem I saw was, even though they're telling me that, it's not actually listed on their specifications, which is important if you want to make sure that everything's safe and everything's actually going to work. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the battery specifically in a battery specific video. But needless to say, I wasn't overly impressed with the rack options. So I ended up going with the Middle Atlantic ERK3525 server rack, which fits 8 batteries. And actually I could go a little bit bigger on the rack and go a little bit taller, but for my situation, it actually fit perfectly. Now I ended up with 2 groups of 4 batteries. Pytes actually recommends groups of 3, which works great if you've got 9 batteries in your stack. But if you've got 8 batteries, 2 groups of 4 makes a lot more sense. And I talked with Pytes and I provided them the specs for my system, and they said that for my setup, 4 batteries works. But again, not every setup would work with that, depending on what your inverter choices are. For example, if I had 2 inverters running in parallel and I'd only gone with 4 batteries, it would actually not work well for that setup. It's way too much power if I was to max it out. Now, there's obviously a lot of settings you can change to make that work. But keep in mind, when you're deciding how to group these batteries, you can actually exceed what the batteries are capable, depending on what batteries you choose and how you set things up. So it is very important that you do the math and figure out exactly what's possible. And Pytes will help you out if you send them an email and say, hey, here's what I'm looking at doing. Is this going to be supportable? Because you don't want to void your warranty just because of how you group your batteries. Now, the next thing is the main AC disconnect after the meter. Now, this is a requirement in my area that whenever you're doing any kind of major electrical work, this is required to add. And it might not be required in your area, but expect that it's probably going to be coming soon if it isn't already required. Now, for this, I went with the Eaton DG224NRB 200 amp fuse safety switch. Now, I did want to choose something entirely different from this. I didn't have a lot of space next to my fence. This fit perfectly. It was 17 inches and I had exactly 17 inches available for working with a little bit of space on the left and the right between the fence and between the meter. So it ended up working perfectly, but ideally I would have preferred to switch the meter out for one that has the breakers built right into it. I thought that was a little bit cleaner install and it uses breakers versus fuses, but in my area that's not allowed. And I did look at some other options where the disconnect was a little bit smaller. It also had the ability to use breakers instead of fuses, but I just liked the setup of the Eaton one that I picked. The look and the aesthetic was kind of what I was looking for. Now this disconnect is UL listed, it's NEMA 3R, so it met all the requirements for what I was looking for in a service disconnect. They also have the added benefit of being very simple devices. You either have a working fuse or a blown fuse. That's pretty much the extent of what can go wrong. It doesn't have any other circuitry or things that you might expect inside of a mid. And I'm not against mid. I actually really like the grid bus from EG4, and I considered getting that also. The problem I had is that it really just didn't fit well, and I really wanted to go with the Sol-Ark. But I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the inverters in a different video. But for my particular requirements, this worked great for me. Now the next in the wiring scheme of things is the manual bypass. Now this is completely optional. You don't need to have a manual bypass. And I went with the Siemens DTNF322R 200 amp double throw non-fuse safety switch. Again, a big part of why I went with this one was cost. It was one of the cheaper ones that were out there. Plus I really liked the aesthetic. It really fit in with what I already had with the disconnect, even though it's a different brand. So it just really fit into what I was looking for on the side of my house. Again, I have an HOA and they're not too bad, but I didn't want to push my luck having a whole bunch of weird stuff on the side of my house. I wanted something that looked really professional, really kind of high end in terms of the look and the feel and the aesthetic. Plus both brands between Eaton and Siemens are great brands for all your electrical work. Now the purpose of this thing is to bypass the Sol-Ark. So essentially I can work on the Sol-Ark system while still having grid going into my house by having the ability to have two on positions. So in my case, on at the top is for grid only, on the bottom is Sol-Ark. Now of note, I didn't add another disconnect. I would have needed another disconnect to essentially bypass the line tap that's running from the disconnect over into the actual grid input of the Sol-Ark. But because it's a line tap, they can back that off and essentially disconnect from the Sol-Ark inside of the Wireway. So I still have options, it's just not ideal. But I couldn't find a really good option based on the amount of space that I had available for an additional disconnect. Ideally, I would have been able to put a disconnect inside of the Wireway, because the only time that I would actually do the bypass and just run off of the grid is if I'm adding my next Sol-Ark, which I do plan on adding another Sol-Ark in the future. That's really the only time I would ever have to bypass the system. Or if something goes wrong with the Sol-Ark and I need to replace it, those are really the only times I would ever have to do it, which means that I'm going to have to take the Wireway apart anyway. Now for the bypass, it's a true 200 amp service rated switch. It's rock solid mechanical design, UL listed, very straightforward installation. Although there was some questions, what I learned about double throws is that there's a couple different options out there and they're all wired a little bit differently. So my double throw might be different from your double throw. Now the next element that I went with is the Victron Lynx Distributor. It's a 1000 amp bus bar that allows for fusing as well. Now there's some people out there that are going to say you don't need to have the fuses in between the Sol-Ark and the batteries. And you're right, you don't have to have that, but it does give you a little bit of peace of mind that if you have some sort of a strange surge or an electrical strike, that you've got an extra element of protection for your system. So I went with 300 amp fuses. My battery cables easily support well over 300 amps. So 300 amps worked for my setup, especially since I'm never going to be really running more than 175 amps per battery cable anyway to each of the battery groups. You could also get the Lynx power ins instead of the distributors if you're not worried about the fuses. And that element's actually a little bit cheaper. Again, I wanted the fuses, so that's why I went with the Lynx distributors. Plus, I really like the 1000 amps. When I add my next Sol-Ark 18K inverter, I'll essentially have 700 amps of battery charge and discharge capability. So I'm still well within the margin for 1000 amps. Even if I was to add a third, I think I'd still probably be pretty good, but I would be pushing it for a 1000 amp bus bar if I had 3 of the Sol-Ark 18Ks set up in parallel. As I'm not sure that I'll ever have 3, it's not a huge concern for me. Now, what are the benefits of using a Victron Lynx distributor or power in over some of the other alternatives out there? First, it's a high quality, highly recognized piece of equipment, and it's modular, but it more importantly includes all the pieces together. So I don't have to buy separate bus bars, one for the positive, one for the negative, and I don't have to kind of piece everything together. When I was doing the math on doing kind of a custom system where I would piece everything together, it ended up costing more than just buying a Lynx distributor. So I found it to be very cost effective, plus it is very compact with all the cable wiring. So I saw a lot of positives in using the Victron system as part of my install. Now, as you can see, I've essentially got 2 sets of cables. I've got 2 groups of 4 batteries going into this, so that's why I've got the 2 sets going in. And then out, I've got 2 sets also, which means that I've got 175 amps per leg essentially coming from the inverter, or a full 350 amp pull. But I'm not really overtaxing the cables. I don't want the cables to get overly warm, which is one of the things I was considering, but I was actually considering as far as a 50-foot battery run. And it was within the voltage drop scenario where I wouldn't have exceeded the recommended voltage drop that Sol-Ark has had I done that. But I think it would have probably been heating things up quite a bit more had I done that. So my run is actually about 18 feet, so well within the margin for voltage drop. And even when my batteries are pulling max or providing max, they don't even heat up at all. There's like no hot spots at all inside of my system. Another thing I did consider doing is an actual switch disconnect where I could actually separate and physically separate the batteries from the inverter. I bought them, but I didn't actually install them. And the reason being, I thought it ended up making the system overly complicated because you need essentially 1 per battery run. And right now I've got 2. When I add the next Sol-Ark, I'll have 4. It means I would need 4 switches to essentially fully disconnect all the batteries. And it seemed like overkill, especially since each of the inverters will have a battery disconnect, and I can very easily just shut the batteries down. So I felt like the actual disconnect, while providing a little bit of peace of mind, that I was, no kidding, disconnected from the inverter, or the batteries were disconnected from the inverter, I didn't feel that it was necessary. All right, so let's talk about the Wireway. Now, the Wireway I went with was 12 by 12 by 72. And you might be saying, well, it's a lot longer than what I need. Well, right now it is, but again, I'm planning on adding another inverter. So it's the perfect length for 2 inverters and the double throw to utilize. And one of the other considerations is I have to stay 3 feet away from the gas hookup. Now, in my case, I've got 4-ish feet, so I've got plenty of space. I really don't have space for another inverter. I think I probably could make it work if I did a little bit of a redesign on things, but there's not a lot of space. And this played heavily into the reason why I went with the Sol-Ark 18K over the FlexBoss 21, just on sheer numbers of how many inverters I thought I might need in order to power my house. So this Wireway fit really well into my system design, but I also really liked that it was painted ANSI 61 gray acrylic with an electrocoat finish. Basically, it's coated at the factory using electricity, and it bonds with the metal in a way that you can't achieve any other way. You can paint a galvanized box all you want. It's not quite the same effect as what happens when you use an electrocoat or an e-coat on metal. It makes it a lot more durable, a lot more corrosion resistant in the long run. And it's essentially what most of your disconnects and your double throws, most of your electrical equipment, that's essentially what's happening on most of that stuff. So this Wireway has that same coating, which is also why it matches in color and it just fits into the system very well. It's basically a much harder, tougher surface, and it has a high probability of lasting a lot longer than a plain galvanized box. Now for the battery cables, and this is the only thing I bought was the battery cables, plus I bought the 2-wire disconnect for the emergency shutoff should I wanted to install that. But the battery cables, I went with Battery Cable USA. Now, I think their battery cables are phenomenal. I looked at some other options out there, but I really like the ability to have them actually set it up exactly the way I want. So for example, the Pytes V5s use an M6 lug. I had the ability to use an M6 lug with an M10 also, which hooked up to my Lynx distributor. So I ended up ordering 8-foot cables set up exactly the way that I wanted, and every single one of those cables was the exact same length, which is important for battery setups. So I found that incredibly useful, not to have to do my own lugs. Even though I've got the ability to do that, I didn't necessarily want to do that on every single battery cable. And Battery Cable USA provided battery cables that were UL listed for use inside of the house. I had no problems passing my permit using them. Plus it was all pre-configured and ready to go for me. I also bought the home runs from Battery Cable USA, and I actually bought way more cable than I actually need. So you're gonna see that I spent a lot of money on battery cables. I didn't actually need all of that. And I've actually got enough cable now that I've got plenty for the next installation, and I could probably do the next 3 installations based off the amount of cable that I've got. Ended up with way more cable than I needed. But again, I was originally planning for the inverters being about 50 feet from the batteries total length. So I bought cable for that, which means that since I moved the batteries a lot closer, I've now got a lot of extra cable. And the other thing that I ended up buying from Battery Cables USA was the actual lugs. So I bought a bunch of extras because I knew that I was going to have to cut and shorten some of these 50-foot runs. So I bought a whole bunch of lugs to allow for that. So I've right now got enough, I think, where I could do the next inverter along with more batteries and have exactly the amount of cables that I'll need. I'll need to buy a couple more lugs for the M6 in order to hook them up to the Pytes batteries. But I've got pretty much everything that I need on M8s plus actual cable at this point. So if you're looking at my cost breakdown saying, wow, you spent a lot of money on cable, you're right, I did, but not all of that is going to be used just for this install. Some of it will actually be used on the next install when I add another rack of batteries and I add that next Sol-Ark inverter. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the actual breakdown of what I bought. Now, the most expensive thing was by far the batteries at a little over $9,000 for 8 batteries. And then we've got the Sol-Ark for $6,800. Now, I have seen this as low as $6,200 depending on sales and that kind of stuff since I bought mine. And I think right now, actually, a lot of websites have it at around $7,200. And then the actual installation cost of having the electrician come out and actually do the install of all the wiring and that kind of stuff was $5,000. And then we get to the battery cable, and I knew battery cable was going to be one of the more expensive items on here. Now keep in mind, I didn't actually use all of this battery cable as part of my installation, so some of these prices would be much lower for your installation if you're going through Battery Cable USA. And then the double throw was around $1,059, and then you've got more battery cable. Again, I explained that again and again. Now the wire trough I got through Rexel. While I really like my wire trough, the one issue that we have with it is the way that you actually connect the lid to it. I don't know that I would buy that approach again. I would definitely buy the type and color and the style of Wireway that I got, but I will say that it's really hard to connect everything together the way that they've got stuff in there. It's not like a fixed point that you're screwing into. The part that you're actually screwing the bolt into moves, which makes it a real challenge when you're trying to put that lid on there. And it's pretty much impossible to do by yourself. I actually took it apart since the installation completed, and it took me probably 30 to 45 minutes to get that thing headed back on there. A lot easier if you've got 2 people, but even the installers were having a really hard time working with that Wireway. So it is kind of a nightmare to work with it the way that it is right now. Unfortunately, Wireways is one of those things where they're probably not local to you, so you're ordering online, and most of the websites that I looked at didn't have a lot of really good pictures of exactly what you might get. And Rexel's no different on that. The picture is nothing like what you actually get. And in my case, the Rexel that's near me didn't actually have it, but a Rexel that was about a couple hour drive from me did, so they ended up shipping it between the different stores. So I didn't actually see it until I picked it up. I was happy with it, but again, it was kind of a challenge as far as the connection points for getting that lid back on there. And then we've got our disconnect. And again, all the links for most of this stuff is in the description of the video. But that was really the more expensive aspects of this installation. The server rack I actually had in my house already, so I didn't have to worry about buying that. Now, typically buying that is around $1,100 to $1,200. It's a 2,300 pound server rack, so it can definitely support a lot of weight. I like the idea that I could have the commercial casters on it and actually roll the thing around. It's got 1,300 pounds that it'll support by having the commercial casters on the system. So I can actually put all 8 batteries into it and actually move it around. And I have done that quite a bit, actually. It made putting the system together much, much easier, having the ability to roll things around. So I didn't move it a lot, but I did move it a couple feet here or there, either closer to the wall or away from the wall as I was doing the installation. And I've been overly impressed with the design of that ERK 3525. For my next server rack, I'm planning on getting the exact same server case. And then it's all the rain tight connectors. The electrical permitting cost me about $240 to do the permitting through the county. And then we've got our Lynx distributors. And again, I ended up getting 2 of those. And I ended up getting the M10 version. So this price is actually for 2. So this should actually say 2 on here for that. And then I've got the R fuse conversion kit. Now this is for the disconnect. My disconnect uses H fuses, and I wanted the ability to use the R fuse. And there's a conversion kit for that in order to use that. And then the conduit, more connectors, the fuses. Now, in the case of the grounding rods, I had to add 2 grounding rods to my house because it's a much older style of construction, and we didn't have the actual 5/8 inch grounding rods. We had whatever was standard back in the 70s for the installation, so this is something I had to add to it. And I did this myself. I just bought the 2 grounding rods. Putting them in the ground is actually surprisingly easy. Just put a little bit of water in the hole, and then just kind of push it in and out until you get it to get stuck again, add a little bit more water, and it went straight in the 8 to 10 feet down that it needed to go without any problems. It was actually surprisingly easy to put in the grounding rods. And then the continuous connection point between the 2, I did all of that myself. It was fairly easy to do. But there was some associated equipment, so it ended up running around $100 for that. Who knows what I would have been charged by the electricians to just do something as simple as that. My dad always taught me, if you've got the ability, you've got the tools and the knowledge to do it yourself. Only hire people for the stuff that you don't have the ability to do. And that's kind of how I looked at the grounding rods. It seemed pretty easy to do, so I just did that myself. Now, the LED adapter actually didn't work. Now, the idea behind the LED adapter was to get the lights working on the Lynx distributor is that you could actually power those. Right now, without a Lynx shunt or some other device hooked up to it, I can't actually use the indicators on the Lynx distributor. So it's really just a bus bar without any actual functionality beyond that. This LED adapter, the idea was that it would make those wires work, but it ended up being for a different voltage than 48 volts. So it didn't end up working for that. And then we've got the 3/8 inch liquid tight kit. I actually didn't end up using this. I thought we were going to use this for the Ethernet cable, but we ended up just putting the Ethernet cable in one of the conduits that wasn't that full. It was shielded Ethernet cable that I ended up getting. So we haven't had any issues with it, but technically you should put that into its own kind of standalone liquid tight kit, like 3/8 inch here. And then we got the lug bolts for attaching everything to the wall. Again, I pretty much accounted for just about everything that I bought as part of this process. Now, in the case of the emergency stop, I did buy that also, just like the battery disconnects, but we didn't actually use it. In my area, I think there's not a lot of people that have done installation, so the inspectors don't really know what they're doing when they look at battery and solar installations. And in this case, they weren't looking for the emergency stop. We had it, so we could always put it in if we wanted to. Now, this is an item that I also got from Signature Solar, but I'll be honest and say I'm not a huge fan of the quality of the emergency stop, and I couldn't find any really good options out there. If you're aware of a good emergency stop that looks professional and doesn't look kind of like a cheap piece of plastic, let me know in the comments, because I can see when I do my next inspection that possibly they might be looking for this thing, and it would be nice to have a more high quality emergency stop installed. And then pretty much everything else is just kind of small things, ins and outs. And as you can see, now that we've updated that Lynx distributor, my total price was around $30,000. Truthfully, it's probably closer to 28 when you get rid of some of the excess cable and get rid of some of the things that I didn't necessarily need as part of this installation, whether it was the battery disconnects or the emergency stop. And there's a couple other things. I ended up buying the wrong size grommets, for example, so I didn't actually need this. But in this case, they wouldn't actually do the return for this, so it was a cost that I had to absorb as part of this process. But this is pretty much the entire list. And again, this is available to download if you go to the Dropbox link in the description of the video. Let me know if you have any questions about the installation or any of the other items as part of my process. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. So that's the full breakdown of my entire installation. Until next time.